Hi little skeletons, it is Disney Queen Skelly here, and welcome back to the True Crime Stories. Today's state is going to be Connecticut, so sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy. Connecticut. Joan Barthel, a death in Cannon. In 1973, Peter Riley, 18, was arrested and charged with his mother's vicious murder. Convinced of Peter's innocence as they were incensed by the overzealousness of the state police, citizens of the small western Connecticut community in which he and his unmarried mother lived alone joined together to raise his bond money, hire him a lawyer, and get him out of jail. A Death in Cannon. By Joan Barthel. Introduction by William Styron. 328 pp. New York. E.P. Dutton and Company. $9.95 by C.D.B. Bryan. On the night of September 28, 1973, Peter Riley, a young man, an 18-year-old boy really, was arrested and charged with the murder of his mother, 51-year-old Barbara Gibbons. As much convinced Aunt Peter's innocence as they were incensed by the overzealousness of the state police, citizens of the small western Connecticut community in which he and his unmarried mother lived alone joined together to raise his bond money, hire him a lawyer, and get him out of jail. What could be more harmoniously American, in the best sense of the mangled word, asks William Styron in his introduction to Jean Barthel's book, than the spectacle of a New England village rising practically en masse to come to the support of one of their own young whom they felt to be betrayed and abandoned. This was the stuff of legends. In fact, before Peter Riley's story was over, such luminaries as Arthur Miller, Mike Nichols, Elizabeth Taylor, Jack Nicholson, Candace Bergen, Art Garfunkel, Gene Widmark, Dustin Hoffman, producer Lewis Allen, and writers John Carey and Renata Alder, in addition to William Styron, had contributed their time or money or thoughts and more towards Peter Riley's defense. Articles had run on the front page of the New York Times. In Newsweek and Times magazines, CBS filmed a segment for 60 Minutes. Good Housekeeping offered $300 for an interview with the defense committee. There was talk of a movie deal, of Peter Riley becoming rich, and someone named George Sire even wrote the Ballad of Peter Riley, which ran in the Torrington Register. In spite of the bright selflessness and concern of these gathering stars, Mrs. Barthel never loses sight of the true heroes, those local Litchfield County citizens whose efforts in Peter Riley's behalf had made the real difference. Mrs. Barthel was herself a newcomer to the Cannon area, whose original article on Peter in New York Times sparked the first outside interest in his case, including that of Jacqueline Bernard of New York City, a modest, generous stranger who provided the bulk of the $50,000 bond needed to free Peter from jail. There was also Father Paul Halavach, curate of St. Joseph's in Cannon, who was quick to testify in Peter's behalf. Mickey and Marion Maddow, the Belignis, the Dickumsons, Beverly King, B. Keith, Norma Hover, Florence Tompkins, who wrote a Dear Neighbor letter to everyone in the Cannon telephone book, and others justly celebrated as the nucleus of Peter Riley Defense Committee. As Elizabeth Mansfield, proprietor of the general store, said to the town meeting shortly after Peter's arrest, "Let's face it, he's in a lot of trouble and he has no one but the townspeople in this world. But Peter Riley would not have needed the town quite so badly had he not confessed his mother's murder." Peter had returned home from a Methodist church meeting between 9:45 and 9:55 p.m. and discovered the mutilated body of his mother. Her throat had been brutally slashed. There were multiple deep stab wounds in her stomach and pelvis, other wounds in her back and one hand. Her nose and both her thighs had been broken. She was lying in a pool of blood, naked but for a t-shirt pushed up over her breasts. Why would Peter Riley confess to having done such a dreadful thing? Partially because from the moment of the Connecticut State Police first arrived on the scene at 10:05 p.m. until 25 hours later, he was held virtually incommunicado, with no knowledge that anyone in his community the slightest concern for him. He was permitted only a few hours of fitful sleep, provided no hot food, and was grilled and grilled and grilled. But primarily, Peter Riley confessed he had murdered his mother because the polygraph machine used by the police said that he had. By afternoon of his second day in custody, Peter Riley was so willing to believe he had done what the polygraph charts indicated. That's when the police pressed him for details on how exactly he committed certain aspects of the crime. he didn't know and pathetically asked his polygraph operator for hints. Most of the first half of A Death of Cannon seems to be taken up by the polygraph transcripts, and they are chilling in their exposure of the Connecticut State Police's dependence on and mindlessness faith in these damned machines. One understands Peter's pathetic deference to authority as a symptom of his rootless upbringing or an indication of his being in shock, but one cannot understand or forgive the police's abuse of authority. On April 12, 1974, Peter Riley was found guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. On May 14th, Judge John Spezial sentenced him to between 10 to 16 years of prison. Just short of 2 years later, on March 25, 1976, after a new hearing and the discovery of new evidence, Judge Spezial set aside Peter's conviction. Between Peter's sentencing and the declaration of the mistrial lie only 35 pages in this book. It demands more. Peter's conviction was based primarily on the admission of his confessions as evidence, despite his repudiation of it the next day. But still, one cannot help wondering how effective his otherwise excellent defense attorney, Catherine Dorabach, could have hoped to have been since, as Mrs. Barthel tells us, she was already unpopular in Litchfield Superior Court, partially because she was blunt and outspoken and liberal, involved in controversial causes, partially because she was a woman and a smart one at that. Attorney Rohraback is on the National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union as a defense attorney at the New Haven Black Panther trials and worked hard for the liberalization of Connecticut's outmoded birth control laws. One wants to know which, if any, of these attitudes upset whom. How biased might a jury have been in this competition between a big city female liberal lawyer and the small town conservative and ambitious local boy? I wanted to know more about how these people felt. If, as we are led to believe, Peter Riley's New England village rose en masse to come to the support of one of their young, why throughout this book does one feel so little sense of community? One hungers for more about the interlocking relationships among these people who grew up together in those small towns. What this story cries out for is an extended examination of the people involved. For all of its authors' very meticulous research and details, A Death in Cannon is a rather cold-blooded book. This story demanded the sort of painstaking examination of the people and their motives that would have turned Cannon inside out. Mrs. Barthel has written a very good book. Were it not for the obvious authority with which she writes of the people involved, one would not be so tempted to ask for more. In short, Mrs. Barthel withholds from us the humanity involved. The law is imperfect, Judge Spezial commented. Like the law, we ourselves are imperfect, and that imperfect we are striving for perfection is what this book should really have been about. At a pre-trial hearing at Litchfield County Superior Court on November 24, Judge Simon S. Cohen dismissed all charges against Peter Riley. Judge Cohen's reasons for dropping the charge on which Peter had been found guilty 2 years before appeared based as much on implications of official misconduct as the evidence itself. So that is it on the Connecticut true crime story. Thank y'all so much for watching. I do want to apologize for how choppy this sounds. I am starting to write my stuff down again, mainly because when I try to read it from my phone, the websites tend to glitch and then they'll just refresh themselves out of nowhere. So this makes it a lot easier for me, but it's also kind of challenging because it wasn't a tiny notebook, but tiny notebook is done. We are now on to the bigger notebook, so I will be able to see my writing a lot better. So hopefully the next few videos where I do writing won't sound as choppy. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye, little skeletons. Please stay safe. I love you guys.